Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Hello and Happy New Year! We thought we'd kick off the new year with an unusual episode featuring Kevin Macnish, host of the Getting Technology Right podcast. A version of this episode also appeared in that podcast feed just before Christmas. If you're at all interested in the ethics of technology, I really recommend Kevin's podcast. I'm a regular listener, find it really useful for keeping up with the latest thinking in technology ethics. In this episode, Kevin and I quiz each other on what we're trying to do with our respective podcasts and on our experience of working as consultants in ethics. Me for the University of Leeds and Kevin for the technology company Sopra Steria. I also just wanted to pass on some news, which is that episodes of Ethics Untangled will now be released twice as frequently as they were before. We've been going almost a year now in this form, and we've been able to record loads of interviews on some really interesting and diverse topics, and we're looking forward to sharing those with you. So if you're a subscriber, and if you aren't a subscriber yet, what are you waiting for? Whereas before you'd be getting an episode on the first Monday of every month, now you'll be getting one on the first and third Monday of every month. By the way, thanks to everyone who's been sharing episodes on social media, telling their friends and so on. All of that stuff's really appreciated. Okay, on with the show. I'm here with Kevin Macnish, who is a consultant for Sopra Steria, an ethics consultant and also a philosopher. Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Jim, thank you. Pleasure to be here. Yeah. Jim, tell me a little bit about your background, how you got into, because I know you are a trained philosopher, but you also head up the consulting work at the Idea Centre at Leeds. So tell me a little bit about your background, how you got into philosophy and how you got into the consulting world.
Sure. The way I got into philosophy was like most people. I did it as an undergraduate degree at the University of Sheffield, and then kind of came out of that and, like a lot of people, didn't really know what to do next, and ended up spending, well, actually, it ended up being almost 10 years in a variety of jobs. So I went and lived abroad for a year teaching English, came back and was a project manager in online learning for a few years, did a year as a copy editor and proofreader. And then basically saw a job advertised at the University of Leeds at something called the Idea Centre as a consultant in applied ethics. And basically that's the only time, before or since that I've seen a job advertised that wasn't a kind of traditional lectureship, but which required a philosophy degree. So I kind of leapt at the chance. So it sounded really interesting and kind of and went from there really. So yeah, so I had a few years between my undergraduate degree and then getting that job. And then once I was in that role, found it really interesting and just wanted to stick with it. And went back to study at the same time. So went and studied for a master's part-time and then followed that straight up with a PhD part-time. So that, obviously doing it part-time takes a while. Finished the PhD in, would it have been something like 2017, I want to say. I think that's probably right. Yeah, so I'm employed full-time as a consultant in applied ethics at the Idea Centre, which is the Interdisciplinary Ethics Applied Centre at the University of Leeds. And that's still very unusual, I think, for an academic to be working full-time as a consultant. I don't know, not just in philosophy, actually. I don't know anybody else at the university who has that kind of role. It's still very unusual. I mean, academics quite often do consulting, but generally it's somebody who has a traditional kind of teaching and research role doing a bit of consulting in their spare time. And it tends to be, in engineering or the medical school or something like that, where there's kind of obvious applications for people's research, and they will do, a certain amount of consulting where they're applying that research in the real world. So, yeah, I feel very lucky that I've got this job. So it's not just me that does the consulting, by the way. We've got a small team. I'm the only one who works full time on consulting, though. The others are on lectureship and teaching contracts. And actually, full disclosure, we should say that you used to be one of those people, right? So we're former colleagues at the Idea Centre. Yeah.
yes, was. Yeah, going to get onto that because, of course, we first met before I worked at the Idea Centre on the master's course. Because we started that off. So I was actually thinking, as you were saying there, I think of part-time doctorates and part-time doctorates in particular as taking forever. And yet we started on the masters at the same time in 2009, was it? 2008.
I think that sounds about right.
So it was around about then. And I got my doctorate in 2013. Sorry, so you were only 4 years later than me, despite doing both of them part-time. So
right, okay. Well, it felt like a long time.
Yeah,
it felt like a long time. Yeah, so it was 2 years to do that master's. Yeah, so I think that's right, 2008 to 2010. And then I went, and actually, as part of the master's course, this is probably too much detail, but as part of the master's course, you have to do like a PhD preparation module. I was kind of planning what I was going to do for my PhD, and then did the PhD. It took me about 6.5 years. And then I actually, having done the PhD, I got some interest from a publisher to publish a book based on the PhD, or largely based on the PhD. And so kind of went straight from the PhD into revising it for that, which involved quite a lot of rewriting and stuff. So, and this was, by the way, it was on the topic of the moral responsibility of psychopaths. So that was what my kind of major research project was. So as a result, I kind of ended up thinking about psychopaths for nearly 10 years. Which probably isn't healthy, but that's just the way it turned out.
But one of those instances about how fascinating philosophy can be in allowing you to pursue something that's quite obscure but really quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It was one of those PhD topics that when people ask you what your PhD is about, they're expecting not to be interested in the reply. But I remember having a few conversations where people were like, "Oh, right, okay, yeah, that does sound interesting." So,
absolutely.
But so you went from your master's and you came and worked as a consultant at the Idea Centre, and then you went off to the University of Twente, right? And then from there to Sopra Steria. Yeah. So could you say a bit about your sort of career path?
Yeah, sure. So, well, like you, started out with the undergrad in philosophy a long time back. I was at the University of Leeds, and I actually went to work for the British government for GCHQ, which is the UK equivalent of NSA, for about 6 years before coming back to philosophy. And as we just said, doing the masters the same time you did, and then moving on to doing the PhD at the Idea Centre in Leeds, where I focused on ethics and surveillance, which was my interesting area. Originally, it was completely by chance. It wasn't designed to come off the back of the work which I'd been doing, but it was a happy coincidence that the two kind of came together in that way. Then when I graduated from the doctorate, I stayed on at the Idea Centre in precisely one of those consultant come lecturer positions that you were talking about, where I was doing consultancy for around 30-40% of my time, lecturing for 40%, and admin for about 50%, I think, because that's how I remember it anyway. And then I went over to the University of Twente in the Netherlands, largely because in the UK, the ethics of technology is not an area that's been very well researched or engaged with traditionally. And I think one of the nice things about Idea at Leeds was that we did a lot of work with engineers and computer scientists, but otherwise it was a fairly niche topic. Whereas in the Netherlands, the philosophy departments, certainly at Twente, Delft, Wageningen, and Eindhoven, all focus on ethics and technology. So you have about 80 to 100 philosophers over there that are just working on philosophy and technology. So it's a very lively area to get into that.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, come the pandemic, I was back in the UK. I was very nearly stranded in the Netherlands while my family was here in the UK, but managed to avoid that and felt it was increasingly time to move back here. So looked around for work. And as you said in your bit, Jim, it's not often you can find jobs which require a philosophy background in them. So you tend to leap at the chance when you do. And it just so happened that Sopra Steria was setting up a digital ethics consultancy at the time. I think it would have been in its early stages for about a year, and they were advertising for somebody to come and join them. So I interviewed and started working with them 2.5 years ago. And then since then, yeah, it's been a solid consultancy since.
Brilliant. And we'll talk a bit about the kind of consultancy work that we've been doing and our approaches to that consultancy work in a bit. But we wanted to talk first of all about the podcast. So, I guess just by coincidence, really, we've both ended up setting up a podcast in our respective roles. And we were talking about it before starting this recording, and it sounds like actually what we're trying to get out of those podcasts is kind of similar in a way. So, but yours is obviously much more specifically focused on the ethics of technology, whereas mine is more general than that. But can you say a bit about what prompted you to start a podcast, and what are you trying to do with it?
Yeah, sure. So in some ways, the podcast, the motivation for me personally was it's a great way of keeping in touch with a load of friends, essentially, and keeping in touch with what's going on at the cutting edge of ethics and technology, because it keeps progressing. And it's very easy in the role I'm in to sort of step back from some of that academic research that's going on right now, because, a lot of my clients that I work with, they don't care what a Kantian interpretation on surveillance would be, for example. But that doesn't mean it's not interesting and that it couldn't be helpful to read about that down the line. So it's very interesting to sort of keep a hand in what's going on in academia. And I think likewise, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in academia, which tends to stay in those academic circles. We within the academic world, you get promoted by publishing academic articles, by publishing books. And although it's starting to increase in the UK, that there's a little bit there around impact and getting your work out into the general public, there's not a huge amount of weight put on it. So one of the things I wanted to do is help to sort of create a bridge between some of that academic work that's going on and what's happening in industry and sort of general practice, and to see how the two could interact a little bit better.
Great.
And how about yourself? Because I say that is very much from the technology and ethics perspective, as you say, because I think that's an area that's just exploding at the moment and has been for a few years, and I can't see slowing down. But yours, I know you've talked about ethics and robots on yours. I really enjoyed that episode. But where's Ethics Untangled coming from, and what's your motivation?
Well, really, I mean, the motivation, I think, for me personally is, well, on a personal level. So as you said, it's kind of a good way of keeping up with friends. For me, it's a good way of getting to know new people is part of it. Actually, quite a lot of the interviewees have been people who I know already, who are based either in the centre or kind of in the university generally. But I've also had the opportunity to talk to, a really wide range of really interesting philosophers and a couple of non-philosophers on some really interesting topics. I suppose as an academic, one of the advantages of it is that you get a little bit outside your comfort zone, so you can end up being very specialized. So there's a kind of, as I said, I've spent a lot of time thinking about psychopaths and moral responsibility. So I could kind of plow my own little furrow thinking about responsibility, and to an extent I'm kind of doing that. But I think there's a huge advantage to actually getting out there and reading much more widely, and the podcast has been a real prompt to do that, because I have to kind of ask credible questions of somebody so that we can get a 45-minute interview out of them, or whatever it is, which involves reading their work, thinking about what I might ask them about it, and then engaging with them. So as a result, I've kind of got into some areas that I probably wouldn't have thought about, or certainly wouldn't have thought about otherwise. And it is really wide ranging. So as you say, that we've had an episode on whether humans and robots can be friends, and there will be other episodes with a kind of technological focus, but there are also, well, I'm trying to remember which ones we've put out and which ones I've just recorded now. But
by the time this one comes out, I'm sure there'll be many more.
There'll be loads more, yeah. So our first episode was on social media and how we should behave online. So it was kind of looking at what goes wrong on social media platforms, and why do people end up at each other's throats and behaving badly and so on, and what are our responsibilities, and how can we make things better. So I think that was a really good example of the kind of subject that I'm looking for really for Ethics Untangled, because it's of really general interest. So kind of everybody who has a social media account encounters these kinds of issues and wants to think about them. But it's something that I think philosophy can contribute something to, because there's been work on things like, well, we all say we're in echo chambers, but the kind of thing a philosopher can do is really analyze what an echo chamber is and what are the normative ethical implications of being in an echo chamber. And, so casting a slightly different light on it, I think that people might not have thought about otherwise. It's the idea is you're always kind of trying to find that balance between it being a topic that's of general interest, but also having some depth on it without it getting too technical. So I'm kind of often asking philosophers to just kind of explain what they meant by, whatever word they've just used, so that it can be understandable by a general audience. So we want it to be definitely challenging. So we're obviously not, we're not simplifying really the work, but we're just trying to explain it in plain language so that people can understand it.
Excellent. Funnily enough, the first episode from the Getting Tech Right podcast was also on social media. So
was it? Right.
Yeah, it demonstrates the crossover just even more. So excellent.
I'll give that a listen. Yeah.
So we were going to go on, I think, and talk about just our experience as well as consultants, and how that looks being trained as academics, but being involved in consultancy. It's not, as we've already said, it's not a standard sort of career path, or at least it traditionally hasn't been. It might increase. So I suppose let's start off with what's your experience been, and how would you describe your approach to consulting?
Our experience has been, we kind of had to go from a standing start really when we started way back in 2006. And so we were kind of thinking on our feet about what kind of project we might be able to do and how we might be able to add value, what kinds of clients we would want to be working with. And it's been a really interesting learning experience as we've gone along. Certainly for quite a large proportion of that time, what we found is that one of the markets that's been most conducive to our kind of work has been professional bodies. So we've done a lot of work in a variety of different professions. So you'll obviously remember from when you were there, we were doing a lot of work in engineering, and we're still doing work in the engineering sector. We've done quite a lot of stuff in financial services, including research for the organisation that used to be called the Banking Standards Board. It's now called the Financial Services Conduct Board. So looking at the ethics of professionalisation in banking, whether the professional model is the way for banks to improve standards of culture and conduct and so on. And then there's just been we do a lot of work with the actuaries, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. They're a great client for us, and some really interesting partnership work we've done with them. Insurance. But then we've also done things like intellectual property law, ecology and financial management. We've done loads of work for the Chartered Surveyors, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So it's ended up being quite broad in terms of the different professions we've worked with. But professional ethics has been a huge thing for us. And within that, it's kind of fallen into two broad types of projects. So it's either been, I suppose, continuing professional development and training and other kind of initiatives around embedding and operationalizing principles in people's work. So whether that's through CPD or through, developing guidance or helping people helping organizations to develop a code of ethics or to review an existing code of ethics and help them think about how to implement that code of ethics so that it can be as effective as possible. So that kind of area. And then the other area has been applied commissioned research projects. So the project that I mentioned for the Banking Standards Board, it ended up being a big mixed methodology project where it was combining philosophical work where we're kind of, I suppose, working with concepts. So thinking about, concepts like professionalism and how those end up being interpreted and applied, and combining that with empirical research. So we did surveys and focus groups and one-to-one interviews with, people in the different banks, but also kind of other stakeholders in the banking sector, like the Bank of England, the regulators, and so on. And so it's kind of people coming to us with a specific question that they want answering, and us using a variety of different approaches and methodologies to answer that question, really, which is kind of, it's kind of similar in some ways. Like there are things that we can draw on in terms of the philosophical research that we do as philosophers, but the approach is very different in that we're not just kind of sitting there thinking, well, that's an interesting question, let's spend a few months thinking about that question. It's a question which is of kind of pressing importance to some organization or other, and they've come to us with that question and wanted us to answer it. So there's been a few projects like that. Another one was with the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, looking at what integrity means for organisations and how organisations can go about getting more integrity and promoting and encouraging integrity in their staff. And there's been a few others. We've done some work in the NHS, those kinds of things, really. And we're increasingly now talking to, I suppose, to kind of businesses and organisations other than professional bodies, and starting to think about helping people to operationalise ethics. And there are, there's at least one project we've got on at the moment where that's in a similar area to where you've been working, I suppose, where we're helping an organisation think about data ethics and how to, what are the issues that arise for that organisation in the use of data? What are the ethical principles that are going to help them to do that in an ethical way, and how to actually implement and operationalise those principles? So how does that differ from the kind of work that you've been doing, Kevin?
Yeah, that's well. I think to start with where you finished. That question around operationalization is the key one, isn't it? Really. I've been working in AI ethics now for about, depending on when you count my start, something like 13 years in some respects, and I would say that the standard philosophical questions about what's important in AI in terms of what are the principles that should be underpinning ethical AI, they've been pretty well established now for at least 6, if not 8 or more years. Right. But the question has moved on a lot to, we all know that AI needs to, and not far off what you've been doing with codes of conduct. We all know that an AI should be transparent or that it should be fair or whatever. But the question is, what does that actually mean in practice? Yeah. How do you make that happen? Now, obviously, we're quite a bit younger than you are in terms of the age of the organization around ethics consultancy. But I think the things we've had have been, yes, again, clients coming to us. In many cases, it's in terms of working out the ethical thing to do from 2 perspectives. One, in terms of risk management. How do we make sure we don't do something ethically stupid, which is going to get us a really bad reputation or lose us customers or whatever, or employees, actually. And the other one has been, how do we boost people's trust in what we're doing, so they are prepared to give us their data, they are prepared to maintain a relationship with us, and so on. So we've worked with one of the big 4 high street banks in the UK when they had a new vision and strategy, and they had a data strategy. For those two reasons, they said they wanted to develop a data ethics strategy as well. So we kind of came in, did a lot of work with them, both internally and externally. So looking at customers as well as looking at the internal culture of the bank, to see how were they operating, what principles did they have on paper, what principles did they have in practice, what were the ethical values that were being lived out in the organization, and then how could we weave in an ethics strategy for them so that they could take that forward. In another case where we worked with the government department, that was more a matter of them coming to us and saying that they had questions around accessibility. Which was not something I originally thought of as being a sort of ethics area, but it really is. And so much of what we've covered with that has not been the technical problems about accessibility. What screen reader do you use? Do you use dictation software, or what font size do you use on a presentation? It's been more about looking at processes and looking at social problems within an organization of what are the cultures? How do the cultures compare with each other? So does security and disability get along with each other, or are there clashes? Is it transparent and easy as to how somebody goes about requesting a screen reader or dictation software or whatever else? And sometimes those things really aren't. And while an organization can shout from the rooftops that they're very accessibility friendly, when you dig into the weeds and you find out, well, actually, a lot of the disabled people are choosing to leave the organization because it's not that disability friendly. That's something they want to know, and they want to hear about how to redress that and how to help that. So those are a couple of sort of recent things we've done, which I think have been really stimulating for me. Trust, again, just keeps coming up as a big one. And in some ways, I find people who find the word ethics a bit scary because they're worried that you're going to judge them, find the term trust to be a much easier way into that conversation. Because it's not about telling somebody, oh, you're being unethical, you're doing the wrong thing. It is, as I said, going back to that notion of risk management, saying just like with your security, just like with the pay you give to your employees, how you carry out your work has risk. And if you are being unethical about that, or if you are not being purposefully ethical, then that risk increases significantly. And so it's just simply a way of asking the questions that an organization may not otherwise be thinking about asking, to try and diffuse and mitigate and ideally just avoid some of those risks happening in the first place.
Right. And I suppose that point about trust is a way of, well, it demonstrates why this isn't just about compliance, right? This isn't just about legal and regulatory compliance, which I don't know whether this is your experience as well, but kind of in the past, I've had the sense that there's been a bit of complacency and a bit of, well, compliance obviously is really important as a huge industry in itself, and just a bit of a sense that, well, if you're complying with the rules, you're going to be okay. But of course, there are plenty of ways of, being within the letter of the law, but still losing the trust of your customers or your employees or whatever it might be. Right.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are all sorts of things like lying, cheating on a committed partner, or sort of areas which we don't say are illegal, but we do think are unethical, and they've been broadly thought to be unethical in all sorts of areas. So, I mean, you're right. Looking across sort of the jobs that get advertised, the ones which I see coming up all the time are ethics and compliance officers. And when I read through the job descriptions, it's all compliance.
Right.
And yet, when we went out a year ago and interviewed the British public about their views on trust and trust with the UK government, one of the questions we asked was, do you think the government should do more than meet the legal minimum requirements to protect people's data? And that was the largest positive response. 70% of people said, yes, the government should go above and beyond the legal minimum, which says that there is a huge expectation that the legal minimum, which is already pretty tight, is not enough, and they expect organizations, the government, to go above and beyond that.
Yes, and I was going to say, like you say, that is one area where the law and the regulation is particularly tight. The whole area of kind of privacy and data protection and security and so on. You can contrast that with things like fairness and bias, where actually
Yeah.
there isn't very much regulation really. And
Although not yet.
Not yet, no, sure.
Because I think the AI Act is going to be a very interesting experience there, at least within fairness, within again, algorithmic sort of artificially intelligent systems. Whether that can broaden out, I don't know, but it's one of those issues that's being wrestled with at the moment, I think, is what exactly does fairness mean and what does it look like. But one of the interesting things that the AI Act is going to bring in is that there will now be an ethics or an AI impact assessment as part of it. And part of that impact assessment needs to look at the impact on human rights of the algorithm or the piece of tech that you're using. And I think that brings in some really interesting challenges there in much sort of less clear ways than happens with GDPR and data.
Yeah. And do you get the impression that the public is kind of increasingly aware and increasingly concerned about those other issues aside from privacy and consent and so on?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think, again, some of the research we've been doing with people, and it's funny you're bringing this up because I don't think of us as doing a huge amount of research at Sopra Steria. Usually It's just going out and speaking to people, but we have sort of latched onto this area of trust in the past couple of years and been doing some work here.
Right.
And the latest one we did, and we've not published this yet, we're still going through the raw data, but we thought, let's just see what sort of an impact the recent scare stories around ChatGPT and AI have had on the public. And I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but quite a significant number of people who have heard of ChatGPT and AI generally are worried about the future of humanity as a result of that.
Yeah.
Which I find bizarre personally, because I think an awful lot of the talk around that is so overhyped. But, the letters written by Elon Musk and others coming out saying this threatens humanity has really struck a chord with some people.
Right.
And some people are genuinely scared about this. And so I think that is something which needs to be taken seriously. And while we can sort of take those in technology, I think, can take a superior view of saying, well, we know really it's not going to be that, it's not that serious or anything like that. Again, if we're talking about trust and how people approach these things, then that's going to be crucial.
That's right. But I also wonder if those kind of more apocalyptic warnings maybe detract from some of the more sort of meat and potatoes ethical issues that are being raised by these advances in technology. I mean, you don't have to worry that like Skynet is round the corner to think that there are things that we should be concerned about, more kind of practical everyday things that are raised by things like ChatGPT that do need to be thought about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're spot on there because yes, and the idea of taking 6 months off just in order to work out what the ethics should be. We've been sort of struggling with this for quite some time. Is an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, ChatGPT already has come out with issues around bias. Bard, the Google alternative, has had problems as well. I mean, so much so that Alphabet lost 10% of its share value in a week when Bard came out. Yeah, I think bias and fairness issues are coming up a lot with those. And not to mention the legality of how they've been created in the first place, because they've been developed by scraping the internet. Yeah. So your doctorate and my doctorate have probably gone in to inform what comes out of ChatGPT, and yet neither of us were asked for permission. And according to GDPR, there was no lawful basis for them to have done that. So I know I've had people on my podcast sort of saying that they're just waiting for the law cases to start piling up against these things. And I've heard reasons that's why Bard isn't available in Europe at the moment. It's those legal concerns.
Right.
And just one more thought, one which a sort of go-to example which I have about problems of bias and fairness is what is known, and you can look it up on YouTube, as the racist soap dispenser. Yes. Which was a company that came out with an automated soap dispenser. You put your hand underneath it, it spits soap into your hand. If you're white, if you're not white, if you've got black skin, brown skin, then you put your hand underneath it and the amount of light reflection isn't sufficient for the dispenser to recognize that your hand is there, and it doesn't spit out any soap. It's a really stupid thing, and it could have just been so easily overlooked by having a diverse workforce on the team that was building it, by thinking to go out and test it against a diverse group of people, and it was just overlooked. And so that's kind of indicative of some of the problems which I think are really underlying the technology that we have, is people just not thinking that extra step to make it aware about all the potential users and how it's going to affect people in society. So that's really the important thing to try and come out with, not, as you say, these existential threats to humanity.
Yeah, because that can be kind of paralyzing, really, can't it? Because you kind of think, well, how are we going? It's either we pull the plug on them or we just kind of submit to our AI overlords. Whereas actually, there are some, so there's more pressing kind of concerns that we need to address right now. But I suppose, one thought that prompted what you just said is that the answer to these things is maybe not just a kind of, a change to people's decision makings, but sometimes it has to be a change to like who's making the decisions and who's involved in the decisions, right? So it's not just kind of saying think more about X and less about Y. It's about actually kind of diversifying your workforce and making sure that a diverse range of viewpoints are represented in the actual decision making process as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we've all got blind spots, and being a white middle-aged male, I appreciate that society is very well organized around people like me. So I probably have more blind spots than many. I remember when I was teaching ethics at Leeds to engineers and coming across the siting of landfill sites, which tended to always be around the poor areas of town. Right. So when it comes to pollution in water and water things, that tends to affect the poorer areas of towns. I remember if you look at the subway map of DC, it's a great diamond, and it looks really neat and everything else. But then if you try to get anywhere in Georgetown, you find out that the University of Georgetown is a 20-minute walk from the nearest subway station.
Right.
Because while it's all done topographically in this really nice diamond, in actual fact, the closest subway stop is miles away from Georgetown. Right. And the story I was told was because it was a wealthy area, and when they were building the subway, the rich people said, we don't want the subway underneath our houses. We don't want the noise and the disturbance. It'd be interesting to know how much that's true of the London Underground as well, or other places. So I think, some of those issues are just kind of interesting to grapple with and see what's going on there.
Yeah, and that's an opportunity for me to plug one of our interviewees. So we've got somebody called Meredith Broussard, who's going to be an interviewee on Ethics Untangled. Whether that'll have gone out by the time this episode goes out or whether it'll be coming soon, I'm not sure. But she's got a really interesting perspective on fairness in technology and diversity. So kind of things to say about what fairness actually consists in. So it's quite kind of philosophically interesting, but also a practical challenge to organizations to be a bit fairer and a bit more diverse in their approach.
But that reminds me about the point of your question as well, which, sorry, I kind of drifted off and forgot the question. So I'm used to asking them rather than answering them. But coming back to those points, it's only when you speak to those people who are affected that you get to find out what those challenges are. And so that's the argument for the diversity. So those issues to which I'm blind, somebody who is black or somebody who lives in a poorer area of a town or whatever is going to be much more aware of those issues than I am. And so while I may think, well, this thing is perfectly fair and perfectly, equitable, it's only when you speak to people who are not like me that I find out, okay, that's not actually the case. And so my assumptions are wrong, essentially.
Yeah. I suppose my final question to you was, what are your kind of priorities for the future? What are you trying to achieve, and where would you like to be in a few years' time with either the podcast or the consulting, or both, really?
Oh, wow. With the podcast, it's interesting. We're just currently going through a 5-year strategic review at the moment at work. So I could to some degree talk about that. With the podcast, I would be thrilled if it's still going, and that we have a good audience of committed people who are engaging with the podcast, I suppose, and writing, emailing in, and sharing topics that they would be interested in hearing about. And yes, just those areas of technology that are coming up. Because I think while the world has been full of ChatGPT for the last 6 months, there's going to be something new next year. We're seeing increased facial recognition. We're seeing increased Internet of Things and sensors developing. So really interested to see where that goes and how that impacts on people. So that's where I'd like to go with the podcast. With the work, I just think, my goal is obviously up. I think there is more work coming in the digital ethics space. More people are getting that this is important. And as I say, legislation like GDPR and particularly the AI Act is going to see that developing further. So I think that as a field, it will become more and more established, kind of in the way that data protection officers have become an established thing in the post-GDPR world.
Right.
So that's where I can see it moving at the moment. And I'm going to throw that one back at you then, Jim, and ask you the same.
Fair enough. Both
Ethics Untangled and the work.
Yeah. Again, in terms of the podcast, I think that I don't have much to add to what you said. Really, it would be good for it to keep going. And I there's every sign that it will do. I'm having no trouble finding interviewees actually, which is right. Great. I wasn't sure how easy it was going to be to persuade people to come on a podcast, but there's plenty of people who are up for doing that. So that's great. So I just want to kind of keep diversifying the range of topics that we cover, keep building the audience for the podcast, obviously. And like you say, it would be good to have people engage with the subjects and kind of come back to us with their thoughts on things that they've heard on the podcast and questions and so on, and maybe follow up on some topics that we've had with further podcasts where we kind of go into more depth in one area or another. So that's the podcast. And in terms of the consulting, we just want to keep having an impact really. So I think you kind of said a bit about impact and the way academics are measured on their research outputs and to an extent on the impact that they can have as a result of their research. So I mean, it's actually the emphasis on impact is increasing, and it's not something that philosophers kind of as a rule find very easy to do. So if you're working on, some abstruse area of metaphysics or whatever, it's quite difficult to find real world impact that you can have as a result of that. So I think we're kind of well positioned to be doing that. But, the most important, way, the way in which impact is most important is just that we want to keep having an impact in the real world. So we're not interested in doing philosophy for philosophy's sake, just because it's interesting. We want what we do to actually make a difference in people's lives. So we want to carry on doing that really. And that's it. Yeah. So
excellent.
That's it.
Well, I think what better ambition can you have than making a difference in people's lives? I think that's a great way to end it. So thanks, Jim. It's been a really good conversation.
Thanks, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.